Kicking off at number 5, the Mad Trapper. And regardless as to whether the true fate of this tale is as apparent as some of our other entries, nevertheless the perplexing story of the Mad Trapper of Rat River is awesome, if not an incredibly mysterious instance of forgotten history. Now, Canadian history in particular is rife with tales of trapping and the fur trade that came with it, especially in the more remote parts of the Great White North. This daring portion of history has ushered in legendary feats of the mysterious men of the mountain, all of which pale in comparison to the Mad Trapper himself, Albert Johnson, a man with no history and no apparent record save for one of the most impossible instances of one man's refusal to be captured. As the legend goes, in early December of the year 1931, residents of the prime trapping site of Rat River had complained to the local Mounties that their traps had been sabotaged, ruining their haul for the season. The only suspect was the new man in town, Albert Johnson, who had mysteriously shown up a few months before without saying a word to anyone and built himself a cabin from scratch. As several of the Mounties paid him a visit to see what the fuss was about, Johnson wasn't in a talking mood and suddenly shot one of the constables without warning. The man survived and the Mounties retreated, but returned a month later, this time with more men and also a boatload of dynamite. When they thought they had the drop on him, the Mounties decided to blow up Johnson's cabin, but bad idea, because as they entered the wreckage to presumably remove his corpse, Johnson emerged from a camouflaged foxhole and opened fire on the officers. He escaped, and what followed was the most bizarre and impossible manhunt in Canadian history. The Inuit said of Johnson that at one point in the chase he was snowshoeing 2 miles for every mile that their dog sleighs could cover. At another point he scaled a 7,000-foot mountain with 0 climbing gear during a blizzard. For over 2 months he lived off the land in the dead of winter without once starting a fire. However, when he was finally cornered and killed, which took an airplane and 9 gunshot wounds, no one still had any idea who this guy was. Seemingly he emerged from nowhere and returned back to it. But the strange legend of Albert Johnson still lives on. Coming in next at number 4, the Ghost of Joe Baldwin. And any list of creepy tales from North America wouldn't be complete without some kind of ghostly yarn about the Great American Railroad, and perhaps none better is the otherwise tragic tale of Joe Baldwin and the mysterious Mako lights of North Carolina, a phenomena of orbs and strange glowing lights that were seen near Mako Station for over 100 years up until 1977. As the legend goes, Joe Baldwin was a veteran train worker and signalman, and on one tragic night in 1867 he was asleep at the rear of the freight when he was awoken by a strange rumbling sound. Joe realized instantly that his carriage had been detached from the rest of the train and quickly came to the stark realization that his car was now coming to a stop on the middle of the tracks. Joe also knew that a huge passenger train was due closely behind them, and in the dead of night, if it careered into the stationary carriage, everyone on board would be killed in a grisly collision. In one moment of heroic sacrifice, Joe Baldwin clutched his lantern and climbed atop the carriage platform as the sound of the oncoming passenger train rumbled ever closer. Trying to catch the attention of the engineer, Baldwin frantically waved his lantern in the air, and thankfully the engineer saw soon enough and slammed on the brakes, saving everyone on board. That is, save for Joe Baldwin, who was still stood on the carriage platform and was gruesomely decapitated by the collision. Legend says that the force of the accident catapulted Joe's head off into the murky swamps that surrounded the tracks, but it was never found. His headless body was buried with full honours as a hero who saved many lives, but for years following the accident, the strange Mako lights could be seen floating at night along the bleak span of railway. As the locals of North Carolina would warn for generations to come, it was the ghost of old Joe Baldwin, swinging his lantern, desperately searching for his own head. Swinging in at number 3, the Hooded Figurine. And for fans of long forgotten history, this one is equal parts bizarre and equal parts overwhelmingly eye-opening. Now, ancient North American history has been steeped in murky mystery and legend, particularly when it comes to the involvement of the Norsemen of Greenland, with the acknowledgement that the first and only confirmed Viking settlement in North America dates back to 1000 AD in L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, supposedly the only of its kind until later European contact. But in 1978, after an archaeologist archaeological dig of an ancient Thule settlement in Baffin Island, a strange carved wooden figurine was uncovered, which proposition seemed to take a much more mysterious turn. At first glance, the hooded figurine seemed to depict a person in a tunic with an etched cross symbol on the chest, first believed to be the depiction of a Greenland Viking, which seemed to correlate with the ancient Norse sagas of Helluland, a place that legend states was visited many times by Viking explorers, where they interacted with the native peoples and perhaps even traded. I mean, that alone is an insane enough notion, but this story has two parts to it, because several other researchers believe that the hooded figurine is instead a depiction of the legendary Knights Templar of the 13th and 14th centuries, which, if true, would have staggering implications to one particular enduring legend of the Knights Templar. As the story goes, after the Order of the Knights Templar were condemned and exiled from Europe by the Pope and King Philip IV in 1307, they fled to Scotland during the reign of Robert the Bruce, where they later fought in the Battle of Bannockburn. After living in exile for many years, the Order later befriended a man named Henry Sinclair, the first Earl of Orkney, who was said to have later sailed through the Atlantic with the Templars and their vast hoard of religious relics and treasures, settling them on the coastal regions of Canada, where they disappeared from the records of history. Think what you will about this legend, and it's important to note that at best the history and connection is incredibly murky, but you've got to admit there is something strangely fitting about the hooded figurine, isn't there? Next up at number 2, the Bell Witch. Perhaps one of the most renowned and haunting tales of the historical American South. In fact, the legend of the Bell Witch is perhaps one of the most notorious paranormal instances of American folklore, in the story of a malevolent spirit that tormented a Tennessee home over 200 years ago. In 1804, a man named John Bell and his family settled on 300 acres of land, which is now known as Adams, Tennessee. Here they built a homestead, living relatively successfully off the land for over a decade, but in the summer of 1817, things started to change. At first, it was odd noises, strange pounding of doors, slaps on the walls, the eerie rattling of chains. Sometime later, John Bell himself discovered an odd creature out in the fields, a strange hybrid of a dog, a rabbit, and something not quite natural. Soon enough, blankets began getting pulled from beds in the dead of night, people were getting scratched, kicked, and their hair twisted and pulled. The spirit soon identified itself to the family as the Bell Witch, a malevolent spirit that offered many explanations to who and what she was, all of which served to confuse things further. In some cases, she said her name was Kate Bat and had been wronged by John Bell in her former life. In others, she claimed to be an ancient American spirit whose burial mound had been disturbed by the family. Either way, the Bell Witch legend gathered so much notoriety that General Andrew Jackson himself paid the residents a visit, where on arrival his horse and wagon suddenly froze on the threshold of the Bell property. His horses strained tirelessly to pull the wagon, but to no avail, before Jackson himself cried out, "That must be the Bell Witch," and as legend goes, he heard a woman's voice whisper that they could then pass freely, as they'd already amused her enough. Whatever the case, the cause of the Bell's torment over 200 years ago remains a complete and utter paranormal mystery, wrapped up in a terrifying and mystifying historical account of the paranormal. Maybe we'll never know, and it's probably for the best that we never do, isn't it? And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, the starving time. And the fact of the matter remains, we have to end this particular historical list with one of the most violent, desperate and gruesome instances in colonial American history. Now, in the early years of the continent settlement, they were trying times nonetheless, and for the first outpost of Jamestown, Virginia, the colonists there tried desperately to carve some semblance of life in order to survive in the New World. For years, though, there have been whispered through legend that the earliest American colonists had survived the harshest of conditions by turning to desperate measures, eating dogs, cats, rats, snakes, even shoe leather to stave off starvation. But as historians discovered in 2012, things were much worse than that, and after unearthing a hastily constructed burial pit of a 14-year-old girl, the first concrete evidence of cannibalism was discovered, leading to many later subsequent discoveries and the stark realization that the Jamestown settlers turned to cannibalism just to survive. Historians have traced back the bleak passage of history to one particularly deadly winter, a period known as as the Starving Time that happened in Jamestown between 1609 and 1610, where settlers arrived during the worst drought in 800 years, catastrophically bringing fatal food shortages for the 6,000 or so people that lived in the Virginian settlement at the time. As history has found, it was a period of complete and utter misery, as the settlers were forced to dig up corpses from their graves in an attempt to eat when there was nothing else left. In one case, documented by the colony's most famous leader, Captain John Smith, one man murdered his pregnant wife in an attempt to salt and eat her, who was later executed by the settlers, and presumably he was eaten too. Yeah. Kicking off at number 5, an ancient Greek haunting. And this tale is just straight up awesome and may in fact be one of the earliest known recordings of a ghost story in European history. And it's a tale told by the legendary Roman author and politician Pliny the Younger way back when in 72 AD. And it concerns a particular haunted house in the Greek capital of Athens. In the city there was a large attractive house that had remained a mystery to the local people as to when and where it had been built, and thus garnered a disturbing reputation. At night, anyone sleeping inside the building heard strange groans and creaks, and sometimes in the dead of night came the rattling of chains. Because of its reputation, it had changed hands through a string of owners. No one wanted to be afflicted by its paranormal goings on. So came a Greek philosopher named Athenodrus, a highly rational man that didn't believe in ghosts and could spot a bargain at the same time. Despite the warnings and the house's terrible reputation, he brought the house for a fraction of the price and moved on in. On his first night there, after an evening of drinking and reading, he of course began to hear the strange sounds of the restless spirit, and after a while Athenodrus looked up to see an emaciated old man peering straight at him with chains bound across his wrists, violent wounds across his body. Undeterred, Athenodrus realized that the ghost wanted him to follow him, and so he did. It led him to the house's garden, where suddenly it stopped and the chains shattered to the floor and dissolved in front of his very eyes. As the legend goes, the next morning Athenodrus ordered a few men to dig up the garden, and in exactly the same spot that the spirit had led him the previous night was the skeleton of a man, still with chains bound around his wrists. Athenodrus arranged for the skeleton to be buried in the conventional way, and from that day forth the spirit was never seen again. Wow. That's one way to do it, right? Coming in next at number 4, the lady with the goat feet. And we're continuing this series with a tale from that mysterious place known only as Portugal. Now, the history of Portuguese culture is just straight up fascinating either way. The oldest state on the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, and perhaps one of the oldest in the whole of Europe, with a rich history of the Carthaginians, Romans, Celts and Moors. And because of that, Portuguese folklore history is ripe with a little bit of everything. As the legend goes for this one, first compiled in the Lendas e Narrativas by Alexandre Herculano, a Portuguese lord by the name of Dom Diogo Lopes was hunting in his lands when he ran across the most beautiful lady that he had ever seen singing out in the field. Instantly he fell in love and promised her all the riches in the world if she married him. She accepted, but with one condition: he could never make the sign of the cross again. As Herculano goes on to portray, it was only when Don Diogo returned with his new bride that he realized there was something different about her. You see, she had forked feet in the fashion of a goat. Hooves. Not one to be deterred, Don Diogo shrugged his shoulders, and the pair lived in happiness for many, many years, where they had 2 beautiful children, Inigo Guerra and Dona Sol. One day though, after Don Diogo had returned from a successful hunt, he awarded his prize hound with a bone, but his wife's dog, a large black demonic looking hound, burst into a fit of jealous hunger and ripped apart Don Diogo's dog in a violent rage. Shocked by such incredible evil and gore, Don Diogo blessed himself with the sign of the cross, and in that moment his wife, the lady with the goat feet, let out a hypnotic screech, screamed and floated into the air. And then her young daughter, Dona Sol, did the same, and the 2 women were never seen again. Now obviously there is a lot of allegory of religious tones to this story in particular, but it does pose the interesting question, where the hell is this story's origin rooted? Next up at number 3, Bishop Thietmar of Merseburg. And outside of everything else, this guy in particular was an incredibly interesting individual and an important chronicler of the ancient kings and holy Roman emperors of Europe. He was born of royalty, but only ever as a prince, and so he made a life documenting the comings and goings of the kingdoms. Because of that, he also came across some pretty bizarre paranormal occurrences, and this one is perhaps his best. As Thietmar was informed by his niece, the Abbess Brigadia, a priest had been given proceedings of an ancient church in Utrecht that had fallen into disrepair but had recently been renewed and consecrated by the local bishop. One day at dawn, the priest saw what he could only describe as dead people making offerings in the cemetery and the church, and could also hear them singing in the pulpits. Disturbed, he asked the bishop, a man named Baldrick, what he should do, and much to his dismay, he was ordered to sleep throughout the night in the church so that he could wrestle it back from the dead. But on the following night, both he and his bedding were thrown out into the cold by a supernatural force. Obviously at this point he was terrified, and so he complained again to the bishop. Again though, after being blessed with saintly relics and sprinkled with holy water, he was continued with guarding his newly consecrated church and ordered not to leave until the dead had been put to rest. But after not sleeping a wink, wide-eyed in terror, just before dawn rolled back around again, suddenly the dead lifted up the priest's body, placed him before the church's altar, and burned his body to a fine ash. The bishop, after hearing the news and confused by the matter, ordered the whole town to penance with a 3-day fast so that he could aid the souls of the departed. In his final writings, Bishop Thietmar stated in this case, "As the day to the living, so the night is conceded to the dead." Swinging in next at number 2, Anaedo. And this story is weirdly terrifying, if not one of the most unfortunate cases in European history that would perhaps put Henry VIII to shame. And it involves a German prince named Joachim II and his favourite hunting lodge, the Jagdschloss Grundelwald, the oldest preserved castle in Berlin. Now, Joachim loved hunting so much that he'd regularly throw 3-day-long festivals to celebrate the thrill of the hunt, and Grunewald soon became his go-to spot, where he'd hide away from the responsibilities of rulership. In fact, he was so smitten by the place that he allowed his mistress, Anaedo, to live there in secrecy, much to the dismay of his second wife, Hedwig, daughter of the Polish king Sigismund I. Now, obviously things were a little bit awkward, but in an attempt to win her husband's favour, Hedwig decided to tag along with his thrill for hunting, and so Anna, in this respect, was often sent away to avoid any confrontation. But during one particular stay in the lodge in the year 1551, the rotten floor beneath Hedwig and Joachim collapsed and broke away. Joachim was incredibly lucky and landed between the beams without any injury, but his wife Hedwig wasn't so lucky, and she plunged through the depths. She shattered her thigh on the rafters, and then, if that wasn't already enough misfortune, she impaled herself on a set of hanging antlers that were on display in the room below. Hunting. You see, Hedwig survived, but in horrific physical health. And what did Joachim do? Of course, he eschewed his wife's needs and headed back to Anaedo so he could carry on the hunt. The thing is though, Joachim and Hedwig had a son, Johann, who grew up throughout this whole ordeal with a burning hatred for Anaedo. Eventually, Joachim grew ill and passed away, but on his deathbed, he made his son Johann promise that he'd look after the one woman that he'd always loved. And no, not his mother Hedwig, but instead Anaedo. As his father died, Johann promised that he would, but the next day he instead ordered his men to capture Anna, where he imprisoned her in the Spandau fortress of Germany, and by imprisonment I mean that Johann walled her in alive beneath a small staircase in the western wing of the castle, where she presumably starved to death and died, and now haunts the spot for all eternity. Yeah. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the tale of the Hun Press. Now, as it's become apparent throughout this video, European history is rife with bizarre, terrifying and mysterious tales, but perhaps none of them are so clearly perfect to be a horror film than the tale of the Hun Press, as written in the 1198 record of English history from William of Newburgh, A History of English Affairs. As the tale goes, there was once a chaplain who wasn't exactly the holiest of men. He drank, he feasted, and he of course loved to hunt. Because of this, he earned the nickname the Hun Press, the dog priest. Eventually he died and was buried as a holy man in the monastery of Melrose, but it seemed that even death couldn't stop the Hun Press. On many nights his corpse would rise from its grave and wander the town, where one night it came across a woman that he'd had relations with when he was alive. Obviously the undead skeletal fiend was still smitten with her and made its way to her bedchambers. Obviously the Hun Press was chased back to its grave, but that didn't stop it, and the lady soon became plagued by the ghoul every single night. She was unable to deter the undead chaplain and had soon become quite the terrifying problem. Distraught, she enlisted enlisted the help of a young friar and a few other men to somehow put an end to the Hun Press. You see, that very night the friar camped out at the cemetery, and when midnight struck, the other men who'd accompanied him had given up, given the fact that it was a cold and damp evening. But as soon as they wandered off, the Hun Press had risen from its grave, set about to attack the friar in all its undead gore, ripping at the young man with his bones and claws. Somehow though, the young friar had a burst of courage and attacked the Hun Press with his axe, striking it hard deep into his body. And it worked, and the Hun Press fled back to its tomb, sealed back for the night. But the friar wasn't done with it just yet, and as dawn rose, him and his men opened the tomb of the Hun Press to find the exact spot where the friar had wounded him, seeping with a vile black sludge flowing with undead gore from the sepulchre. As William of Newburgh later noted, the men took one look at the Hun Press and burned the body to ash, where they scattered him to the winds. Kicking off at number 5, the tomb of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, the legendary Roman politician and general Marcus Antonius, alongside his kindred spirit Cleopatra, may well be the most notorious lovers in the history of our civilization, and although mountains upon mountains of literature have been written about their star-crossed fate, the real mystery of Antony and Cleopatra came after they had both slipped from this mortal coil. Now, if you know anything about the Roman conquest of Egypt, you'll know that around 30 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were not in the Romans' best books, and a general known as Octavian had waged a long and bloody campaign to bring Cleopatra's reign to an end, which he ultimately won. But sadly for us, that's where the trail runs cold, with no leads as to the two lovers' final resting place. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries in antiquity is the exact location of the final burial place of Antony and Cleopatra, but according to several ancient historians, Tonius and Plutarch to name a few, it was recorded that Octavian had permitted the two to be buried together, as their surviving children were taken back to Rome to be raised as Roman citizens. There are several leads that their tomb was located somewhere west of Alexandria, but numerous excavations throughout history have proven fruitless. However, they did come close, and between 2008 and 2009, reports of the prestigious Egyptologist Zahi Hawass having found evidence of their fated tomb came to light. Although no concrete evidence has been unearthed, relics and memorial coins of the lovers have been found in small ceremonial tombs, perhaps pointing toward Cleopatra's and Antony's tomb being somewhere in the vicinity. The excavation continues, but whoever stumbles upon the tomb of Antony and Cleopatra will unearth one of history's greatest mysteries. Next up at number 4, the Sack of Baltimore. And now, I love this particular entry, partly for its many layers and potential implications, but mainly for the fact that it's a swashbuckling tale of chaos and carnage that seemingly came out of nowhere. On June 20th, 1631, a small village named Baltimore in West Cork of Ireland was randomly and viciously attacked by pirates. Not just any pirates though, but pirates from the Barbary coast of North Africa, which at the time was synonymous with the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you couldn't tell, that's quite a distance. This incident would go down as the largest attack by Barbary pirates in both Ireland and Great Britain, and seemingly the target was a tiny village tucked in the corner of the Emerald Isle. So it posed the glaring question, why? Was it just a random chance of opportunity after the pirates had drifted off course? Perhaps, but it's not likely. See, the attack was led by a Dutch captain by the name of Jan Janszoon van Haarlem, who had changed his name to Murad Rees the Younger, which, if you can't tell, is a bit of a curveball. But that curveball may have actually been thrown by someone else entirely. You see, despite being a small village, Baltimore was actually in the middle of a power play. At the time, it was under the control of a Gaelic chieftain, Sir Finian O'Driscoll, but the nearby English colony of Cork, led by a man named Sir Walter Coppinger, also had Baltimore in his sights. History is unclear as to who pulled which string, but all signs point toward the bizarre pirate attack being orchestrated by someone else entirely, in the hopes of seizing power away from O'Driscoll. In fact, several texts have even suggested that O'Driscoll's own relatives may have orchestrated the move, as they'd been exiled to Spain following defeat at the Battle of Kinsale. Whoever did it overestimated the bloodthirst of the Barbary pirates though, because following the raid, Baltimore was virtually deserted for several generations. The best laid plans of mice and men, yeah, you know what they say. Coming up next at number 3, St. John's Dance. And you may have heard mention of this one before, but perhaps not in this context. You see, it's important that we note that in modern times, St. John's dance or St. Vitus's dance is a terrible disease also known as Sydenham's chorea that affects the nervous system and results in a series of hysterical jerking movements of the limbs often exhibited in young children. Generally speaking, it isn't infectious, but that doesn't figure to explain the countless records of mass hysterical dancing that occurred throughout history, of literally thousands of people across Europe being afflicted by a manic need to dance. The earliest known outbreak occurred in the 7th century and was primarily thought to occur during times of intense hardship, particularly affecting the peasant and working classes. So what? You're a peasant in Dark Age Europe and all of a sudden you just start dancing and can't stop, somehow infecting the rest of your village, town or city until there's a horde of people doing the exact same thing, potentially collapsing from exhaustion or dying from a heart attack. Well, yeah, because that's exactly what happened. One of the most well-documented cases was in 1518 in the Austrian city of Strasbourg, where a woman named Frau Troffia began dancing in the streets, and within a month 400 people had joined her. Yeah, she danced for a month and loads of people died. Now there are many theories on the true explanation of St. John's dance, and scholars still argue as to whether it truly was a real contagious disease or merely a social phenomenon. One of those theories suggests a particular fungi had infected their crops, and another suggests that it was all a misunderstanding and St. John's dance was actually the practice of some secretive European cult. Yeah. Beats me, guys. Swinging in at number 2, the remains of Richard III. And this one, strangely enough, is the perfect blend of ancient mystery and potentially contemporary unexplainable intrigue. Because that's exactly what you all came for, right? Also, I mean, this one is already pretty much solved, but it's in the details where its mystery truly shines. We all know Richard III, right? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. But well, apparently this woman, Scottish author and historian Philippa Langley, knew him a little bit better than anyone else did. Now, it's important to note that history had long forgotten the final resting place of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England, and after his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth, his remains were scattered to the winds of history. After all, history is written by the winners. Well, let's fast forward to modern times when in September 2012, Philippa Langley led an excavation of a car park in Leicester city centre. A few signs pointed toward it potentially being the ruined remains of Greyfriars Church, but in the words of Langley, she had a strange feeling, one that she couldn't quite place, and something was telling her that Richard III was buried beneath that very car park. Now, the dig team was on a very tight budget and only had one chance at excavating a tiny portion of the car park. And guess what? The exact place that Philippa Langley had a strange feeling about turned out to be the final resting place of Richard III's remains. And not only that, but the parking space that he was buried beneath was marked with a large painted R on the tarmac, used to signify a reserved parking space. I mean, all of this can be explained away, right? Eventually someone would have found the remains of the dead king, but you can't deny the fact that the strange cosmic coincidence that led Langley to his final resting place is much more mysterious than a dead English king in a car park. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Tunguska Event. And I absolutely love this entry for its cosmic significance alone and the potential warning sign that we should all be very wary of. Let's head on over to remote Siberia, where on the bright summer morning of the 30th of June 1908, a massive impact explosion, the likes of which has never before been seen in human history, completely flattened a remote area of the Siberian wilderness, covering over 2,000 square kilometers of isolated forest. As far as we know, no one was caught in the blast, but if they were, they would have certainly been obliterated by a shockwave 1,000 times greater than that of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The Tunguska explosion completely flattened over 80 million trees in its blast radius, rupturing their roots like grass to a lawnmower. 50 or so miles away, those native to the region were knocked flat on their feet by the blast, windows shattered and buildings subsided. For all intents and purposes, it was the result of an unimaginable power. And if Tunguska had occurred over a metropolitan area, an entire city would have likely been flattened. So, what was it? Well, the leading scientific consensus is that the explosion of the Tunguska event was caused by the impact of a small asteroid, one that had possibly burned up in Earth's atmosphere and then produced a shockwave that resulted in the aforementioned cataclysm. However, not everyone buys that hypothesis, and many other researchers and scientists have proposed the Tunguska event being the result of a leak of natural gas from deep within the Earth's crust that became ignited by a storm and resulted in the Tunguska hellfire. Most evidence though points towards towards Tunguska being the result of an asteroid, albeit one that luckily somehow missed the vast majority of our entire populated planet. It's also important to note that researchers believe Tunguska to be the result of a small asteroid, which is a terrifying thought in itself. It poses an incredibly important question: how would our history have been shaped if the Tunguska event occurred somewhere else? What if its intended target had changed? And more importantly, are we prepared if it ever happens again?
Number 5 on this list is the pyramids. The Great Pyramids are located in Egypt and are some of the oldest structures on the entire planet. The pyramids are said to have been constructed over 4,500 years ago and were made to act as the burial grounds for the pharaohs of Egypt. The Great Pyramid, which is the biggest of all of them, is over 450 feet tall with a base of over 750 feet wide. That's a really big structure and acted as the largest structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. It should also be noted that the pyramids are made up of massive stone blocks. For the Great Pyramid, it's estimated that 2.3 million stone blocks are what keep it standing to this day. Every block of the Great Pyramid also weighs approximately 2.5 to 15 tons. Just a reminder that a ton is 2,000 pounds, so there were some blocks that could have weighed close to 30,000 pounds. All of this is completely unbelievable. So unbelievable, in fact, that people think something else might have been at play in making them. It's currently believed that these were made by humans. It took thousands of humans to construct, but when you think about how monstrous these creations are and the technology that humans had back in that day, it becomes very hard to believe that we were capable of doing that. This has led people to the theory of aliens. These pyramids are also built to face the precise magnetic north, which makes people wonder how the ancient Egyptians could have possibly got that information. The theory is that these aliens came down and built the pyramids and the ancient Egyptians mistook them for gods. This is why in some ancient Egyptian drawings we see gods flying around. The Daily Star also reports the speed of light is 299,792,458 meters per second, and the geographic coordinates for the Great Pyramid coincide with that if you just move the decimal points over several spaces. They believe that this was a clue from the aliens for us to discover later. Frankly, as cool as aliens are, I would honestly rather believe that humans made the pyramids. It's pretty cool to know that almost 5,000 years ago, our species was able to make something like that. I feel like I have a little bit of pride for those ancient Egyptians. Number 4 on this list is the Bermuda Triangle. You've obviously heard about the Bermuda Triangle before and the lore that accompanies this extremely mysterious place. If you don't know what it is though, then the History Channel classifies it as a mythical section of the Atlantic Ocean roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where dozens of ships and airplanes have disappeared. These disappearances have continued to this day, but started hundreds of years ago. Basically since people started crossing over the Atlantic Ocean and records of ships were being kept. In fact, it's believed that William Shakespeare's The Tempest was based on a real shipwreck that happened at the Bermuda Triangle. So legends of this place can at least be dated back to when he wrote that play, which was in the early 1600s. In 1918, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle reached an all-time high when the USS Cyclops, a massive ship from the United States, sank to the bottom of the ocean. This ship was over 500 feet long and had over 300 people on board. It was a horrible catastrophe when it happened. What made this even more stupefying was that the ship had the capability to send out a distress signal and didn't do so, making everyone wonder what on earth happened. What has caused all these shipwrecks and plane crashes over the years is still unknown, but there are some theories. Some people believe that the Bermuda Triangle is home to a massive sea monster, potentially the Kraken or something like that. A massive tentacled monster with the ability to drag a ship down to the depths of the ocean and eat all who are on board. Some people believe that there may even be a wormhole that is out there in the middle of the ocean. A wormhole is a ripple through space-time which experts believe would act as a portal to another time and dimension. The Bermuda Triangle has also been called the Devil's Triangle before, indicating that some people believe this place could be the work of the devil or some strong sea demons out there. Nobody really knows the true cause of the Bermuda Triangle, and considering it's been talked about for hundreds of years, we may never know. Number 3 on this list is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is very similar to the pyramids, having been built roughly 5,000 years ago and being so difficult to construct that people think some sort of paranormal events must have transpired. Located in Wiltshire, England, Stonehenge is a monument that features massive stones standing vertically that weigh roughly 25 tons. That's 50,000 pounds of weight that these monstrous stones have to them. The monument is oriented towards the sunrise on the summer solstice, but other than that, not a lot of people know why it's there or what its purpose was. Now it is owned by the Crown and considered a heritage site, but still people wonder, why was it put there in the first place? Some theories involve its effect on sound waves. When two people are playing a pipe and you walk around the stones, then you'll notice an effect where they cancel each other out. Some people have even chalked it up as being an ancient sex symbol, believe it or not. However, the most popular theory is similar to the pyramids in believing that it's aliens. I tend to believe aliens were capable of this more than the periods, to be honest. They are certainly arranged in a strange fashion and they have no set purpose. How is it possible for humans to lug stones that are 50,000 pounds to a location where there aren't that many stones to begin with? Stonehenge just screams like the sort of place where something paranormal happened, in my opinion. Number 2 on this list is Jesus. I feel like this wouldn't be a complete list if I didn't include one of the most mysterious events that occurred in all of history. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago during a tumultuous time. His life was one that we all remember and has inspired millions of people since he passed. His death is where something paranormal may have taken place though. Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. This was ordered by the governor Pilate, who felt the pressures from the Roman people and felt like he had to give in to them. The crucifixion process lasted for over 6 hours apparently, until Jesus finally gave his last breath. After he died, he was taken to his tomb, which was closed off and shut by a massive stone. This tomb was guarded by several officers for days, until on the 3rd day it said that the rock moved and Jesus ascended from that tomb to heaven. His body was no longer in the tomb on this day, and the belief that he went to heaven spread throughout the land. Now, a question a lot of people ask is, how do we know for sure that his body was gone and that tomb was actually empty? Now, we know that because after he was gone and his followers were claiming he was resurrected, then the best way for the Romans to stop that theory would have been to produce the body, which they were never capable of doing. So where did it go? Well, it's widely believed that Jesus ascended to heaven, that God acted and brought his son home to him. Maybe this event is less of a paranormal event and more of a miracle, but I still wanted to include it in this video. Number 1 on this list is the Dropa Stones. The legends of the Dropa Stones is a little bit up in the air, but if it is true, then there is certainly something paranormal afoot. The Dropa Stones are a collection of 716 circular discs that are said to be over 12,000 years old. They have very strange markings on them in a language that hardly anyone is familiar with. These stones were apparently discovered by Chupei Tay, a Chinese archaeologist in the 1930s who found them inside some abandoned caves. They made their way to a translator who was able to decipher some of the markings and learn that they were referring to humans and aliens. So the theory is that aliens were present 12,000 years ago and had some serious interactions with humans back then. Now, there are a few reasons why we can't take this as being full fact. 1, it's possible that the translator who was in charge of deciphering them is wrong. We can't say for sure that they're familiar with the intricacies of language 12,000 years ago. Number 2 is that today, nobody knows where these stones have gone. They aren't in a museum and their location is unknown. And this is really hard to believe considering there are 716 of them and they would have been one of the biggest archaeological finds in years. All of this being said though, if these stones are real and our translator was correct, then that is undeniable proof of an alien presence from 12,000 years ago, which is pretty cool to think about.
Kicking off at number 5, the Birdcage Theatre. And if you're particularly interested in the breakneck history of the Wild West, then this place may already sound a little familiar to you. Tombstone, Arizona, the last boomtown of the American frontier. It's an important place enough, and it appears that all of the bloodthirsty moments of violence and murderous revenge all seem to happen in one location. The Birdcage Theatre originally opened on December 26, 1881 by owners Lottie and Billy Hutchinson with the intention of being a respectable variety show theatre for the equally respectable inhabitants of Tombstone, Arizona. If you know anything about the history of Tombstone though, respectable didn't exactly meet their aspirations, and Billy and Lottie quickly began to cater for a different kind of crowd entirely. It is said that between 1881 and 1889, 26 murders were documented as taking place at the Birdcage, mainly for its reputation as being a melting pot meeting point for every angry criminal and gunslinger in the Wild West. In fact, the longest poker game in history was played in the basement of the Birdcage Theatre, which still holds the record to this day. Anyone who entered the table had to pay $1,000 up front, which was a small fortune back in the day, and notable players included Bat Masterson, Diamond Jim Brady, Adolphus Bush, Doc Holliday, and the legendary Wyatt Earp. The poker game itself ran for the entire duration that the Birdcage Theatre was open, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a total of 8 years. It is believed that over $10 million were exchanged in the game for its duration, which is insane when you think about it. Regardless though, with as much intrigue and cold hard cash pouring into the place, people obviously clamoured for a slice of that pie, and the Birdcage was the site of countless bloodthirsty altercations, and still to this day, the souls of many unfortunate frontiersmen and women are said to roam its ruins. Also, if you haven't seen Tombstone starring Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell, stop what you're doing right now and go and watch it. Coming in at number 4, The Horse You Came In On, which, come on, is an awesome name for a bar, right? Sadly for us though, its original name was far less mysterious, but it's also the second place of intrigue on our list that just so happens to serve booze. And for this particular establishment, there is one infamous ghostly figure that may be inexplicably tied to its history. Quoth the Raven nevermore, our man Edgar Allan Poe. Built in 1795 in Baltimore, Maryland, and founded as a saloon under a completely different name, the bar was built next to the docks and served as a drinking hole for the sailors, shipbuilders, and other such miscreants that populated 18th century Baltimore. Obviously this combination was a winning one, and the saloon soon garnered the attention of a much more haunted kind of clientele, none other than Edgar Allan Poe. You see, as the legend tells it, this bar was the last bar that Poe would pass on his way home, and you know, given the kind of musings that he was frequent to, it often required a few liquid libations to spur on the inspiration of some of the finest works of gothic horror literature ever written. In fact, Poe became such a frequent visitor to the saloon that it is widely considered to be the last place that he was seen before his mysterious death in 1849. As the legend goes, the saloon was the last place he drank before being found on the night of October 3rd, 1849, deliriously wandering the streets of Baltimore rambling about horrors unseen. He died 4 days later. The cause of his death is still a mystery to this day, and some say that after leaving the bar he was found wearing clothes that weren't his own, repeatedly calling out the name Reynolds. Some sources say that Poe's last words were, "Lord, help my poor soul," but all medical records have since been lost, including his death certificate. Whatever the truth is, it is said that the bartenders often leave out a glass of cognac after last call at the Horse You Came In On, the drink of choice for Poe. And as they say it, every morning they find the glass empty. Next up at number 3, the legend of the Death Tree. For all intents and purposes, Avila, Missouri is very much a ghost town. First built in 1868, the town itself has been the site of some particularly strange moments throughout history. But now, with a population of just 125, the place has been in decline ever since the late 70s. Despite that though, its particularly dark past has managed to cling on to one of its most fearsome legends, that of the Death Tree and the malevolent spirit of Rotten Johnny Reb. You see, due to its positioning as a border state, like most places in Missouri, the town of Avila found itself split during the Civil War, with both halves falling on either side of the conflict. Because of that, Avila was the site of some rather grisly encounters, and as the legend goes, during the war, the skull of a Confederate bushwhacker was found out in the woods that bordered the town, the grim remains of one particularly bloody battle. However, instead of burying the skull, the locals hung it from a tree as a warning sign to other bushwhackers to stay put in the wilderness and not spill out their conflict toward their town. Well, obviously this action had the complete opposite effect, and the legend of Rotten Johnny Reb was born. Ever since his skull was hung on the death tree, his spirit roamed the town, searching for Unionists to murder in revenge for mocking him. Over the years, many deaths were contributed to the existence of Rotten Johnny Reb, and as his supernatural power grew, the vast majority of the remaining townspeople quickly fled Avila, terrified by the tales of the phantom bushwhacker. According to the old legend, the only way to ultimately end the curse and finally put Rotten Johnny's spirit to rest is to find his skull out in the wild, cut it down from the tree, and bury it in holy ground. However, those that knew where the death tree resided have long since passed, and so the true knowledge of its location has faded from memory. As the locals tell it, there was once a belief that black crows would flock to the death tree during the day and perch upon its twisted branches. Some say that it was an apple tree that no longer bears fruit, and if you ever find an apple out in the woods, you'll find another nearby, leading you to its ghostly realm. Swinging in at number 2, the Axeman of New Orleans. And really, we can't talk about creepy North American history without addressing one of its most bloodthirsty mysteries, the Axeman of New Orleans, a murderous killing spree that reigned from May 1918 to October 1919, taking the lives of 6 innocent people and grievously injuring 6 more, and that may also have started much earlier in 1911, but that's anyone's guess. You see, despite the very public panic and revelation of his crimes, the Axeman was never identified, and the murders remain unsolved to this very day, and more than likely, they will never be solved. As the name suggests, the Axeman's modus operandi was to murder with an axe, which strangely enough often belonged to the victims themselves. In most cases, the scene of the crime was relatively similar, where a panel on the back door of a home was removed with a chisel, where the Axeman then entered covertly. Even stranger still, none of these crimes were motivated by robbery, and the Axeman never saw fit to steal from his many victims. Which begs the question, why? You see, whilst the notorious H.H. Holmes is widely considered to be America's first serial killer, the Axeman of New Orleans is considered to be the first and most outwardly public, toying with the Louisiana police during his campaign of terror. The vast majority of the Axeman's victims were Italian immigrants or Italian Americans, leading many to believe that his crimes were ethnically motivated. Whilst many media outlets sensationalized many aspects of his crimes, given the fact that there was next to nothing to go on, the leading theory was that the Axeman was operating on behalf of the mafia, despite lack of any evidence whatsoever. The strangest instance of the Axeman came on March 13, 1919, where a letter to local newspapers was sent by the Axeman stating that he would kill again at 15 minutes past midnight, but would instead spare any homeowners that were playing jazz music. That very night, every single dance hall in New Orleans was filled to capacity, and bands of all calibers played jazz at hundreds of houses and private parties across the city. There were no murders that night, and that was the last correspondence of the Axeman of New Orleans. His bloodthirsty mystery forever unsolved. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, the Brown Mountain Lights, which is an intriguing name nonetheless, but the truth of the matter remains there is perhaps no other such source of North American mystery than the Brown Mountain Lights, a potentially paranormal phenomena with so many differing explanations that it's anyone's guess where on earth this legend first started. The lights themselves are a series of ghost lights that emerge near Brown Mountain in North Carolina that reportedly on any clear evening can be seen for miles across the mountain overlook. Now, although there are countless instances of strange lights that emerge all across North America, the Brown Mountain Lights seem to stand out as the most consistently sourced and verified. The earliest verified accounts date all the way back to September 24th, 1913, where a fisherman reported to the Charlotte Daily Observer that he had seen mysterious lights just above the horizon every single night. First dismissed as a trick of the horizon, the site became the study of the US Geological Survey, who gave credit to the witnesses' claims in 1922 by dismissing the possibility that the lights were in fact passing trains following the events of a flood that destroyed the electrical grid, and the lights continued to appear during the study. Throughout history, there have been countless potential origins of the Brown Mountain Lights, many of which are wrapped up in tragic tales of lost lovers or wandering woodsmen. However, the oldest and perhaps most profound explanation dates all the way back to the year 1200, where the legend goes that the Cherokee and Catawba nations engaged in a vicious battle upon the ridge of what is now known as Brown Mountain. There, so much blood was shed by either side that even the bodies of their most mighty warriors were lost beneath the soil. That night, after the fight had ended and the blood spilt, the women of both tribes lit torches and they scoured the ridge for the bodies of their fallen loved ones. It is said that night after night they would light their torches again in search of their lovers' bodies, never to be found. Local legend says that this mournful scene was so tragic and intense that it is forever imprinted into the historical fabric of the mountain, haunting it for eternity.
Number 5 on this list is the Catholic persecution in Britain. This happened in the 16th and 17th century and was really not a good time to be alive if you were Catholic. The list first says, Britain has been trying to rebrand its historical image with tea and monocles, though it's hard to do given how violent its history has been. We're not even talking about the colonies here. A civilian in Old Britain may die in a variety of ways depending on the time period. The worst worst, however, would have probably been during the Catholic Rebellion and their eventual persecution. It was generally a time of upheaval in Europe, largely over the question of which kind of Christianity is the best one. The situation was especially bad in England, as the ruling Protestants really did not like the Catholic population. If you were suspected of being a Catholic or harboring one, there were a number of creatively horrifying ways you could die. One woman was slowly and publicly crushed to death simply for refusing to talk when she was questioned for supporting the Catholics. You could be drawn and quartered, hung, or just lynched by a mob. The mob thing was rare, as the central authorities made sure to intervene and kill you themselves before the situation got so out of hands. How nice of them. Yeah, so just a casual death by public crushing for maybe supporting Catholicism. This is a time in history that I feel doesn't get brought up nearly enough based on what happened. In all honesty, I didn't even really know about this time until I started doing some research for this video. Maybe that is because the British government has tried to do a full rebrand and doesn't really want to bring up the dark past of what was once one of the worst times to be alive. Throughout history, people have consistently been persecuted for their beliefs and how they want to live their lives. This was one of the worst examples of that in history, and it's definitely not a time that you would have wanted to be alive. Number 4 on this list is the Siege of Sarajevo. This time really isn't that far off from us at all, folks. This siege took place from 1992 to 1996. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, and had you have lived in this place during that time, life would have been hell. List first says, sieges are an overall bad time to be in, and we highly recommend not being in one if it could be helped. Some of the most prolonged sieges in history, like the Siege of Leningrad, have been huge humanitarian disasters too, as sieges primarily affect the citizens. One particularly horrifying siege that isn't mentioned that often is the Siege of Sarajevo by the Serbs, which is also the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. It went on for almost 4 years, and close to 14,000 people ended up dying. If the incessant shelling on primarily civilian areas like the market didn't get you, you could die in many other ways. People were dying just from the harsh cold, as there were no fuel supplies in many parts of the city. Quite a few of them had to move into shared spaces with other families without any amenities, turning an otherwise functioning city into a giant refugee camp. Many people were killed by snipers who deliberately targeted civilians. Think about being a citizen in that city during that time. Your entire life is literally just about surviving at that point. And not just for a week or for a month, for literally 4 years. 4 years of constant attack in horrible conditions to live in. 4 years of fearing that you and your family are going to be killed. 4 years of freezing and having no good food to eat at all. And this literally happened not that long ago, guys. This just as easily could have been one of us that was caught living there. You were just in the wrong place in the wrong time, and now your life is uprooted and you need to fight to stay alive. Number 3 on this list is the Sengoku period. This was a period that took place in Japan from about 1467 to 1600. List verse says, the Sengoku period, lasting over 100 years, was one of the most defining parts of Japanese history, as well as one of the most influential. A lot of historical Japanese pop culture is set in that period, as it was a time of consistent war and rapidly shifting political climate. There were more warlords fighting for territory than you could count, as the central power of the shogun had weakened in recent times. For someone living in that period, war and suffering would have been part of your daily life. Apart from opposing factions regularly raiding villages and towns for supplies, civilians were often caught between battles they had nothing to do with. Of course, that wasn't the case in every village across Japan, as many of them thrived due to the shifting landscape too. For those caught between the battles or just lost in the vast swaths of ungoverned Japanese territory though, it was a dangerous time to be in. The period was noteworthy for its brutality and general disregard for human life, and gave way to some of the most fearsome samurai warriors in Japanese history. There are a few documentaries on this time period of Japan, and they are all very informative and super interesting. It's pretty neat to look back now and see what was going on, but back then, having to live through it, that would have been horrible. It really was like a massive game of Risk that everyone was playing. And even if you were just a farmer trying to survive, it didn't matter. You were now caught up in this massive game of Risk, and your life was constantly definitely on the line. Number 2 on this list is the Roman Empire. Okay, wait, I thought the Roman Empire was supposed to be one of the greatest empires ever. Well, it was. And if you were one of the leaders or a member of the elite class during this time, then you were laughing. But for some, it wasn't as nice. Specifically, the miners. The Roman Empire had a lot of slaves, mostly people that were taken from conquered territories and forced to work for the Romans. The worst possible place that you could be sent, though, was the mines. If you were a slave and you got sent to the Roman Empire mines, then it's about to get horribly bad. The conditions were awful down there. Mining was relatively new back then, and there wasn't really any advanced technology to help these people. Not that they would have received any help anyways, though. The Romans were brutal to these people, and specifically handpicked people they didn't like to be sent down there. Disease was widespread because people were literally worked to death and never cleaned. They were given very little food, and if they weren't producing quick enough, then they would just be killed. And oftentimes, these killings were of amusement to the guards as well, and they would mutilate you or throw you in a pit with a hungry wild animal. There were literally no redeeming qualities to the mines at all, and you probably wished for death if you got sent there. And finally, number 1 on this list is the year 536. Kind of a specific year here, folks, but from what I've heard, it was literally the worst. This verse says, when us laymen talk about the worst times in history, we're thinking of stuff like violence and proximity to cannibalism. We don't have any scientific parameters to measure how bad a time is for the people living in it, though we can make educated guesses. When it comes to actual scientists, though, they don't bother with guesses or estimates, and have calculated the exact year it was the worst time to be alive in history, the year 536. Apart from the falling empires the world over and general political chaos, the year 536 also marked one of the worst global famines in human history. The famine was due to ash in the air blocking the sunlight, which isn't surprising as there were also quite a few humongous volcanic eruptions around that time for good measure. The foggy eclipse of the sun, as it was described then, was visible everywhere in the world, giving the whole thing an even creepier vibe. Combine that with brutal conflicts in many places around the world, and you know why the researchers chose the year 536 to be the absolute worst one in history. So basically, year 536 was just hell on earth. Everyone was either dying or fighting, or they were dying of not having any food at all. It's kind of crazy to think that only a few thousand years ago, this could have been us. Nowadays, farming is so advanced that most of us are in a pretty good place when it comes to food, but back then, if the river dried up or the sun didn't come out, that was it, guys. We just aren't gonna be eating anymore. Just be thankful that the year is 2022 right now and not 536.
Coming in at number 5, we've got an ancient Egyptian ghost story. Back in 1200 BC, somebody in ancient Egypt decided to put a ghostly story to paper, or pottery, I suppose. An Egyptologist named Gaston Maspero published this story found on 4 pieces of broken pottery, which tell the tale of a man who spent a night next to a tomb and was awakened by a ghost. This man then went to the high priest Kamsuheb and told him about the experience. From there, the high priest decided to summon the ghost and hear his story. When the specter arrives, he claims that he is Nabusmek and that he's been disturbed in the afterlife by some sort of damage or trespass upon his tomb. It's not totally clear because more pottery pieces haven't been discovered yet. So the priest offers to rebuild a new tomb complete with a gilded coffin to make the spirit peaceful once again, but the ghost expresses some reluctance. He says that others have offered similar things but never followed through. So to prove his commitment to the cause, the priest then shares the ghost's fate for a little bit, living without food, water, air, or daylight. The text ends before the story concludes, but it seemed likely that the plan to pacify the phantom worked. Tales like this are relatively common in Egyptian lore, as they did believe in life after death. It's less creepy than a mummy rising from the tomb and killing people, but back then I feel like they didn't have all the modern, scary storytelling tools that we so enjoy today. Coming in at number 4, a chained ghost in Athens. This one comes from a Roman senator known as Pliny the Younger. Even though the story was told before his death in 113 AD, it still survives. That's a long-lasting ghost story. According to this storyteller, there was a large and roomy house somewhere in Athens that should have been quite a popular location. Instead, it had a bad reputation and no one wanted to live in it. After the tale made its rounds, the philosopher Athenodorus went to see what could be done about the ghastly, noisy figure. He stayed in the house, and when the ghost finally appeared, he calmly approached it, marked the spot in which it materialized, and then ordered it dug up the next morning. Underneath, the skeleton of a man in chains was found, rotting away. Obviously, the man had endured a terrible fate and was tethered to this spot, lacking a proper burial. Once the proper funeral rites were complete, the ghost appeared no more, and the house was no longer haunted. If only modern ghosts were this easygoing. I feel like anything that gets exorcised these days tries to kill and maim whoever was involved. Just chill. I'm trying to help you. Coming in at number 3, we've got ROM Hall. This almost 400-year-old manor is full of ghost stories. It's huge and has a long, haunted history. The spirit of Lady Dorothy Townshend, wife of the second Viscount of the estate, is said to roam the grounds. She died after contracting smallpox in 1726 and was known to have had an affair. Scandalous. For whatever reason, she wanders the manor dressed in brown, earning her the title the Lady in Brown. The spectre was first seen by Lucia C. Stone around the Christmas of 1835. Soon after, a Colonel Loftus also saw the ghost and claimed that she had empty eye sockets and a glowing face. These tales were passed around from person to person with little to no evidence until around 100 years later, when a photographer for Country Life magazine showed up to take some snapshots of the estate. They had set up their camera to capture some pictures of the stairwell when a hazy figure appeared. The picture was taken, and when developed, seems to show a translucent figure floating down the steps. It's quite the famous image and has attracted a fair deal of scrutiny. Maybe it's a double exposure, maybe it was doctored. However, no one's been able to prove either of these theories, but I suppose the same can be said about the ghost itself. Coming in at number 2, we've got Okahara Woods. Also known as the Suicide Forest, this thick bit of flora sits at the foot of Mount Fuji in Japan. Plenty of disaffected people have come here to end their lives over the years. Nowadays, there are signs placed urging people to seek help, and volunteers often head in to try to talk people out of committing suicide. The forest is so thick and dense that folks need to bring colored tapes and ribbons to help them find their way back to the entrance. It doesn't help that most sound is muffled very effectively, making the whole area eerily quiet. On top of the dark denseness of it all, the soil is also rich with magnetic iron, which causes phones, GPSs, and even compasses to malfunction, leading people to become more hopelessly lost if they're not careful. Some say these technological issues are proof of demonic presence. As with anywhere where death is common, these woods have plenty of ghost stories associated with them. According to legend, people would bring family members here in times of famine and leave them to die. This was done to save food for others. Those left in the woods would slowly starve and become what are known as yurei, or souls filled with hatred, sadness, and a desire for revenge. Superstitious folks believe that these yurei would walk around screaming near their bodies, and often people tasked with removing their deceased from the woods would play rock, paper, scissors to figure out who had to do the scariest job. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Tower of London. This 900-year-old building is absolutely full to the brim with ghosts. There are enough stories to fill volumes of books. We can talk about the Queen's house, where Arabella Stuart roams. The first cousin of King James I married against the king's wishes and was sent to the tower as punishment. Her ghost floating around seems to tell us that she's still there serving time. If you were to visit the Martin Tower, you might run into a fuzzy grizzly ghost. Back in the day, all sorts of exotic animals were kept in here as an exotic zoo of sorts. Among these fascinating creatures was a bear. And this bear must have been treated very poorly because it stuck around for the afterlife to cause some mayhem. There's a story of the bear appearing before a guard and sending them into shock so bad that they died. I mean, I get it, it's a ghost bear. Fans of The Shining might find something familiar in the next tale, the tale of two ghostly twins. It's said that 2 young princes were murdered in 1483 and the culprit was never found. So now it's not uncommon to see 2 little boys holding hands, melting into walls and floating between rooms. Come play with us, Danny. I could keep going forever with these stories, but we've only got so many hours in the day, so I'll cut it there. However, if you're interested, you can look into Anne Boleyn's Headless Ghost, The Woman in White, or even a set of haunted armor. Seriously, this place is a hotbed for ghostly activity.
Kicking off at number 5, Coral Castle. And no, that is not my imitation of Rick Grimes trying to call his son a fortified structure. Sorry, that was a terrible joke. But the actual mystery of Coral Castle is equal parts true engineering enigma and equal parts perhaps the most American thing that you've ever heard of. Along the highways and byways of rural America, there are countless tourist attractions that litter the way, but one of them in particular may actually have a much more intriguing mystery than the rest. Just before 1920, a Latvian man named Edward Skalnin was jilted by his young bride just a day before their wedding, and so dejected and depressed, Edward left his home country to head to America. Here, after becoming a recluse and discovering a strange affinity for magnetism, Edward spent the next 28 years constructing a bizarre megalithic castle from oolite, a limestone sediment similar to coral. Now, although the vast majority of this structure now is ruinous, which operates as a popular tourist attraction on the roadside, the actual structural properties of Coral Castle have baffled people for decades, given the fact that Leeds Scalding worked completely alone, shifting over 1,000 tons of oolite rock into place with no conventional machinery and no other means of hauling such a large amount of minerals and materials. As the legend goes, at one point a few local teenagers claimed to have stumbled upon Leeds Scalding working on the structure late at night, reporting that he had caused the blocks of coral to move like hydrogen balloons, floating perfectly into place without the aid of any tools. Strangely enough, this led to wild rumours that Leeds Scalding was using telekinesis to build the castle, a claim which he refuted. In fact, the only tool that Leeds Scalding ever spoke of using was a machine that he referred to as a perpetual motion holder. Before his death, whenever he was asked how he constructed the place, he simply stated that he understood the laws of weight and leverage well, and on several occasions he stated publicly that he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids, and that once you know how to do it, it's easy. I mean, this one is a little tongue-in-cheek, but what do you guys think? Another eccentric recluse with too much time on his hands, or a structural genius that had insight into a long-forgotten knowledge? Let me know. Coming in at number 4, Kaspar Hauser. And who the hell was Kaspar Hauser? A mystery that has completely perplexed historians for nearly 2 centuries, leading to an insane web of speculation, an entire network of conspiracy that extends its tendrils all the way to the royalty of Napoleon. On the 26th of May 1828, a teenage boy appeared on the streets of Nuremberg, Germany. His name was Kaspar, a boy of 16. He was filthy, could speak only a few words, and had a letter with him addressed to a captain of the Bavarian cavalry. He kept repeating the phrase, "I want to be a cavalryman as my father was," in Old Bavarian, but the city guard dismissed his ramblings and imprisoned him as just another vagabond in Nuremberg Castle. His strange origin drew the attention of the city's mayor, who claimed that despite his stunted appearance, the boy had an excellent memory and was quick to learn. Eventually, after befriending the mayor, Kaspar spoke of what he could remember of his life before, and explained in great detail at living totally alone in a darkened cell 2 meters long, 1 meter wide. Each morning, Kaspar said, he would wake to find rye bread and water next to his bed. Periodically, he said the water would taste bitter, and after drinking it, he would sleep more heavily than usual, where he'd wake up to find his hair and his nails had been cut. Kaspar claimed that the first human he had contact with was a mysterious man dressed in a dark hood, his face completely covered. He taught him to write his name and taught him the same phrase he would repeat when he was found. Eventually, this story led the European aristocracy to believe that Kaspar was an exiled prince, held captive for his entire life to prevent a line of succession. As the year passed, Kaspar would live and learn in many of the Bavarian noble houses, where allegedly there were many attempts on his life by the same hooded men that he had described in the darkened cell. They got him in the end though, and on the 14th of December 1833 he was mysteriously stabbed and he died 3 days later. On his grave in Latin read the words, "Here lies a mysterious one who was killed in a mysterious manner." Beats me. Next up at number 3, the mystery of Oak Island. And whilst many of you will know this particular entry, there's no denying the fact that the eternal mystery that is Oak Island is worth mentioning every single damn time, and its inception is an event that has long evaded the unscrupulous eye of history. You know the story, right? In Nova Scotia, just off the coast of eastern Canada, lies a small island that has allegedly been the site of our civilization's greatest of treasures, although no one has ever been able to locate the exact point of where that treasure lies, causing countless individuals to fall into a wild obsession with unearthing its eternal mystery. In fact, the cause of Oak Island's mystery is down to the fact people have found treasure there, many of which have been carbon dated to several hundred years old, and the story of the Money Pit, a mysterious shaft that has been excavated countless times throughout history, which actually exists with actual structural records, has forced dozens of businesses to go bankrupt trying to solve its enigma. So here we are with our mystery. Who the hell built this place? Now, there are hundreds of theories as to who would have constructed such an intricate place to conceal their treasure, the most popular being Captain William Kidd, the pirate that sailed to North America in the late 1600s, burying his plunder there so no one else could find it. Another theory states that the pit was constructed to house none other than Mary Antoinette's jewels, who after the Parisian uprising at the Palace of Versailles gave her treasures to a lady-in-waiting, who then fled France and ended up in Nova Scotia, where using her royal connections, contract contracted the French Navy to construct the Oak Island pit, making sure that the incredibly rare jewels of her queen would never be discovered. And strangely enough, there has actually been credible evidence for this theory recently in 2017, when a 500-year-old brooch was discovered containing a huge garnet similar to that of which Mary Antoinette was reported to often wear. I mean, we could talk about all of these theories for an entire video, but as so far as unsolved events in history go, this one remains to be exactly that. Swinging in at number 2, the Yonaguni Monument. Okay, where do we even begin with this one? Because if you've seen any of our Ancient Mysteries series, then this one definitely deserves its place amongst their ilk. But the event that we're possibly alluding to in the case of the Yonaguni Monument may be a geological enigma that predates known civilization itself, involving an entire continent submerging deep beneath the ocean. Yeah, and whilst that may sound like a massive leap, let's just take a look at the strange properties of the Yonaguni Monument before we jump to any kind of conclusions. Off the coast of Japan, submerged beneath the southernmost Ryukyu Islands, lie a formation of potentially man-made monoliths, which has led to decades of debate as to the true nature of this strange geological formation. The monument itself consists of very fine sandstone and mudstone, with its main feature being a rectangular formation measuring about 90 feet tall and consisting of several other strange formations that seemingly don't make sense as to how they have been naturally formed. Now, despite this massive debate between the Yonaguni Monument being natural or man-made, perhaps the most mind-blowing theory comes from the renowned geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, who states that the Yonaguni Monument is indeed most likely a natural formation, possibly used and modified by humans in the past before seemingly sliding away to the murky depths of the ocean during a geological event that occurred in ancient history. On the flip side, the geologist that discovered the monument, Masaki Kimura, claimed that the structure was undoubtedly artificial, created by an ancient civilization at least 10,000 years ago, accurately carved and created before sliding into the ocean following unknown tectonic activity. Kimura also goes on to say that not only that, but he can also identify a nearby pyramid, castles, entire roads, other monuments, an entire stadium at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah, this one is quite something. What do you guys think? Let me know. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the creation of Baalbek. Because, holy moly, if this one isn't one of the most mysterious unsolved events in history, I'm not entirely sure what is. Who the hell built Baalbek in Lebanon, the most mysterious ruins of the entire Roman Empire, a monumental, supposedly 2,000-year-old temple to the god Jupiter that sits atop 3 separate 1,000-ton stone blocks? To put it into perspective, the monoliths at Stonehenge weigh about 1/40th of that. Yeah, you heard that correctly. 1,000-ton stone blocks. And despite being the diligent record keepers that they were, there is no record of who ordered this temple to be built, how these monolithic stones were cut, why they were cut, or how they even came to be, and how the temple itself came to be abandoned, because for the most part, whoever built Baalbek just up and left. Now, there are many mythological and cultural legends as to the origins of Baalbek. Some say that Cain built it to hide away from the wrath of God. Others say that giants built it at the command of Nimrod, which would eventually become the Tower of Babel. In fact, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, some claim that the intergalactic landing pad alluded to in its tale was in itself Baalbek, a site constructed purely for the reception of ancient astronauts. In fact, though, the actual mystery of Baalbek resides more within its geographical location. What was the point in cutting such enormous rocks out in the middle of nowhere? Why was this temple even built where it was? And why would the Romans go to such great lengths to create a structure that wasn't efficient in location instead of next to a major city or a port? The Romans weren't exactly known for doing things without efficiency and purpose. That's what made them so successful, after all. In fact, Baalbek seems so out of character to have been built by the Romans that many scholars completely eschew any historical engineering correlation with them and simply state that the Romans never built Baalbek but discovered it and then added their iconic pillars to Jupiter and repurposed the ruins as their own kind of temple. Yeah, I'm stumped, guys. The construction of Baalbek, who made it, when they did, how they did it, and why they did it remains to be one of the most mysterious events in history.
Number 5. The WOW signal. In a 1959 paper, Cornell University's physicists had speculated that any extraterrestrial civilization attempting to communicate with radio signals might use a frequency of 1420 megahertz, which is naturally emitted by hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. In 1973, after completing an extensive survey of extragalactic radio sources, Ohio State University assigned the big ear to the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence famously known as SETI. Giant dish. Think Jodie Foster in Contact. 1977, Jeremy Amon, a SETI volunteer astronomer, was analyzing by hand large amounts of data processed by an old IBM computer. He spots a series of signal intensities and frequencies that left him and his colleagues astonished. The WOW signal was the first radio signal detected from Earth. The signal came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. Amon discovered the anomaly a few days later while reviewing the recorded data. Impressed by the result, on the computer printout he circled 6EQUJ5 and wrote 3 letters beside it. WOW. Leading to the event's famous name. The signal lasted for the full 72-second window during which Big Ear was able to observe it, but has not been able to detect it since, despite several attempts by Amon and others. It remains, as 2020, the strongest candidate for an extraterrestrial radio transmission ever detected. To this day, nobody can explain the signal, even though many have tried, claiming it could have just come from us. I don't know. What do you think? Number 4. Harvard's psilocybin experiments. Operation Midnight Climax, 1954, consisted of a series of CIA-run safe houses and what went on inside them in San Francisco, California, and New York City. In 1960, 2 psychologists, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, ordered psilocybin from a Swiss company named Sandoz, with the intention to test if different administration modes lead to different experiences. They believed that psilocybin could be the solution for the emotional problems of the human brain. The first test group was 38 people of various backgrounds. 167 subjects in total participated in the study, willing or unwilling. In 1961, Leary decided to orient the study towards psilocybin mushrooms and the rehabilitation of prison inmates. The San Francisco safe houses were closed in 1965, and the New York City safe houses soon followed in 1966. Operation Midnight Climax and Project MK Ultra were considered to be so secretive that few people, even of the highest government positions, knew of their existence. Midnight Climax being a sub-project of MK Ultra's The Mind Control research program that began in the late 1950s by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was a chemist of the CIA. Unlike Project Artichoke, Operation Midnight Climax gave Gottlieb permission to test drugs on unknowing citizens, which made way for the legacy of this operation. Hundreds of federal agents, field operatives, and scientists worked on these programs before they were shut down in the mid-1960s. Science or sinister? Number 3. Exercise Tiger. Exercise Tiger, or Operation Tiger, was a series of large-scale rehearsals for the D-Day invasion of Normandy 1944, in which the military's lack of communication resulted in friendly fire from an Allied convoy being destroyed by German submarines, resulting in the deaths of at least 750 Americans. Wow. Of the 2 ships assigned to protect the convoy, only 1 was present. The second ship that was supposed to be present had been in a collision, suffered damage, and had to be repaired in secrecy. Because Allies' naval headquarters were operating on different frequencies, the American forces did not know this, and the first practice assault took place and was marked by an incident involving friendly fire. They didn't know it was an exercise. Set for 7:30 a.m., it was to include live ammunition to acclimatize the troops to the sights, sounds, and smells of war. This followed an order made by General Dwight Eisenhower, who felt that the men must be hardened by exposure to real battle conditions. Several of the ships landing that morning were delayed until 8:30, an hour later, and some landing craft didn't even receive word of the change at all. Landing on the beach at their original scheduled time, the second wave came under fire, suffering an unknown number of casualties. Rumors circulated along the fleet that as many as 450 men were killed, and it remained in secrecy in classification memos for numerous years after. I've seen Saving Private Ryan, and I can only imagine what this site looked like. Number 2. The Manhattan Project. Nuclear fission by chemists in 1938 made the development of the atomic project a theoretical possibility. The Manhattan Project was a research and development exercise during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. It was led by the United States with the support of the United Kingdom and Canada. Nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory that designed the actual explosives. The Army component's first headquarters were in Manhattan, hence the name, the place name, and the official code name. The project began in 1939 and employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion to fund. Research and production took place at more than 30 sites across the US, United Kingdom, and Canada. During 1939, physicists drafted the Einstein-Szilard letter, which warned of the potentials of this extremely powerful creation of a new type. They had it signed by Albert Einstein and delivered to President Roosevelt. In 1941, President Roosevelt approved the atomic program, and Roosevelt chose the Army to run the project rather than the Navy because the Army had more experience with large budget scientific projects. Plutonium was then chemically separated from the uranium by scientists, and the Fat Man and Little Boy implosion weapons were created at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. The first nuclear device ever detonated was the Trinity test, conducted at New Mexico's Alamogordo Range 1945. Little Boy and Fat Man explosives were used a month later in the atomic droppings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the immediate post-war years, the Manhattan Project conducted weapons testings, development of new weapons, promoted and supported medical research into radiology, and it maintained control over American atomic weapons research until the formation of the United States Atomic Energy Commission in 1947. Classified stuff, people. These were very scary times. And coming in at number 1, the Philadelphia experiment. This one scares me, and I pray it really is a hoax because there's a lot of documents that relate to this subject around this time that don't really add up. The Philadelphia experiment was an alleged event witnessed by Carl Allen and the United States Navy shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in October 1943. Allen describes an experiment where the US Navy attempted to render itself invisible, cloaking the destroyer USS Eldridge, and the bizarre scientific events and results that followed. On Allen's account, the destroyer was successfully made invisible, but the ship inexplicably teleported to Norfolk, Virginia for several minutes and then reappeared back in the Philadelphia yard. The ship's crew was supposed to have suffered various side effects including insanity, intangibility, and being frozen in place. The story first surfaced in late 1955 when Allen sent a book full of handwritten letters referring to the experiment to a US Navy research organization. The US Navy maintains that no such experiment was ever conducted, that the details of the story contradict well-established facts about the USS Eldridge, and that the physics the experiments are claiming to be based on doesn't even exist. What do you think? I think this actually happened and the gruesome details of the side effects are just misinformation. I don't know. I get a weird feeling about this one. Too many science experiments at that time.
Number 5 on this list is the expeditions of Ernest Giles. Ernest Giles really only has himself to blame when it comes to his expeditions because he went on 4 separate ones. You'd think that he would have learned his lesson after the first one, but I guess not. Ernest Giles lived from 1835 to 1897 and was an explorer of Australia. Not much was known about Australia at this point other than the fact that it was pretty big. Ernest Giles wanted to shed some light on the country and made it his mission to explore the continent. His first expedition was in 1872 and was decently successful. Him and 2 other men wandered around the continent and discovered some interesting landmarks on the way. The second one wasn't nearly as well thought out though. Ernest set out on an expedition with 1 other man named Alfred Gibson. Apparently Alfred Gibson knew absolutely nothing about exploring in the desert though, so this was a pretty silly move to have this guy be your one partner. At the 8-month mark, the 2 were deep into the Australian wilderness when one of the horses died of thirst. This was pretty problematic and meant that one guy was either walking or getting left behind. Well, for Ernest, it was a little bit of both. Somehow they came to the conclusion that Alfred Gibson would take the horse and ride on ahead and Ernest would travel the rest on foot. The insane part about this though is that Ernest actually survived and Gibson didn't. Gibson was never heard or seen again and presumably perished in the desert. Whereas Ernest, after an 8-day walk with no food, carrying a massive cask of water on his back and hallucinating the entire way, managed to survive. The one piece of food that he had in the 8-day journey was a baby walleye, and he wrote in his journal that he pounced upon it, ate it, living, raw, dying, fur, skin, bones, skull, and all. Guys, I'm totally cool with going on the occasional hike, but that whole thing, that's a bit extreme for me. Number 4 on this list is David Livingstone's expedition. David Livingstone lived from 1813 to 1873 and was a Scottish physician and also an explorer of Africa. He was notably most fascinated with the Nile River and where it came from. That's why in 1866 he decided to set out with a group of local guides on foot to discover where this river actually originated from. Clearly Livingstone didn't conduct the hiring process well enough though, because these guides, they weren't to be trusted. They led him for a time, but soon started to become bored of this expedition and realized that they had all the power in this relationship. They abandoned him, with some of them even stealing a few of his supplies. When they got back to society and were asked about his whereabouts, they told everyone inquiring that he had just died in the jungle. This was a pretty bad situation for Livingston to find himself in, but it actually gets a lot worse. He trekked through the jungle by himself for a time, but eventually had completely run out of supplies and had to get assistance from someone. Lucky for him, there were some passing slave traders that used this route often. Unluckily for him though, they brought him to the village of Bambara. Clearly the villagers here were not accustomed to seeing a white person and were pretty shocked by this. They responded by taking Livingston and putting him into a zoo. That's right guys, David Livingston was put into a roped off cage so that he could be an attraction for those passing through the village. Finally, someone who knew Livingston heard of this man that was caged up and came to his rescue. When he got there though, Livingston wasn't in the best shape. Extremely malnourished, crippled, and currently dying of malaria, he'd definitely seen some better days. He was saved from the cage, but didn't last too much longer after that, eventually dying from disease. This story just goes to show you that if you're gonna get a guide, make sure it's somebody that you can trust. Number 3 on this list is the South Pole Expedition. Sir Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish Antarctic explorer who lived from 1874 to 1922. After hearing about his 1914 expedition to Antarctica though, it's actually a miracle that this guy made it all the way to 1922. The explorer had the goal of making it across Antarctica. They'd intended to take a ship, land on the continent, and then trek across it to the other side. What they were going to do when they got to the other side is anyone's guess, but luckily they never even needed to worry about that part. No, the issues for them happened far earlier. As they were sailing to Antarctica, they started slowing down and slowing down and slowing down until they finally stopped completely. They realized that the water around them had turned to ice and they were now frozen in place. Rather than get out and walk it, they decided to wait until the ice thawed and then they would keep going. They apparently sat on that ship waiting for this to happen for 10 months though. Then at the 10-month mark, the ice didn't break and their ship just actually sank. So now we have this group of explorers without much supplies, stranded on the ice in the middle of an ocean. They were smart enough to save their lifeboat though and managed to take it and themselves to the nearest landmass. By this point, the expedition was completely ruined and now they just needed to focus on survival. They had to leave some men behind and Ernest and some other guys got in a lifeboat and decided to sail it over 800 miles in the ocean. It should also be noted that this was during World War I, so if they ran into the wrong ship, then it could have all been over for them anyways. They made it to land and then they realized that to get to people, they actually needed to climb an entire mountain range. And believe it or not, they actually did and finally made it to some civilization on South Georgia Island. This expedition didn't lose as many men as some other ones, but pretty much anything that could go wrong did go wrong. The fact that anyone survived is truly pretty miraculous. Number 2 on this list is Ferdinand Magellan's expedition to the Philippines. So you probably remember the name Ferdinand Magellan from history class growing up. If you don't though, he was a Portuguese explorer best known for his expedition to the East Indies across the Pacific Ocean. The actual expedition resulted in completely new trade routes opening up and the discovery of the interoceanic passage. This was definitely a success, but it wasn't quite as nice for Magellan or most of his crew to be honest. Out of the 260 people that left for this expedition in 1519, only 18 actually survived and made it back home 2 years later. The biggest problem that took most of the lives of these explorers was food supplies. Back then, no one had any idea how big the ocean actually was and how long it would take them to sail across it. Therefore, the food and water that they brought along with them was woefully insufficient in feeding 260 men for an extended period of time. Several months went by on the high seas and the supplies started to wear thin. With no sign of land in sight, the crew had to resort to drastic measures. It started with crumbs that were filled with maggots, then moved on to cooked leather that was on the boat, then went straight to sawdust, and then finally to any rats that they could find. This was just for food though. For drink, they had to have yellow water. I feel like I don't need to explain what that is, but I can promise you that it wasn't pretty. Many people died from disease and malnourishment on the boat before they finally reached the Philippines. Here, they were attacked by a bunch of natives and Magellan was stabbed in the face with a spear. So I suppose that you could argue that this expedition wasn't cursed since they actually did reach their destination, but 18 out of 260 is a pretty rough ratio of survivors, and drinking pee-pee water while eating boat leather, I mean, that doesn't sound too great either. Number 1 on this list is the Spanish expedition to the Gulf of Mexico. Back in the early 1500s, there was a craze in Europe for acquiring gold. This was especially true about the gold in the Americas, this magical new land of resources that had recently been discovered. Well, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and yeah, that's his actual real name, was a Spanish explorer who wanted to get in on the action. He decided to organize an expedition to America right around where Florida is, get his share of the gold, come back to Spain, and be a rich man. This didn't work out the best for him or countless men that he decided to bring along though. The Spanish explorer managed to round up about 600 other Spaniards to come along in this expedition for gold. They set off from Spain and actually managed to cross the Atlantic without too much of a hitch. When they got to what's now the Dominican Republic in a layover, they did lose roughly 100 of the men though. Now this wasn't too bad because they still had about 500 and the 100 men just decided that they were done with the mission and wanted to stay in the Dominican, but it was the beginning of the bad luck for the remaining crew. After leaving this layover, they immediately got hit with a massive hurricane which killed tons of men and lots of their horses. Then, when the remainder of the crew arrived in Florida, not only were lots of their supplies already lost, but they had to fight off countless waves of native attacks. They were losing miserably and had to get out, so apparently they broke down their weapons and supplies and tried to make some makeshift boats to get away from where they were. This actually worked for a little bit, right up until they got hit with another hurricane and fell into the sea. At that point, the roughly 80 men that survived this had to get to shore, but very quickly when they did, got enslaved by the native people that had been attacking them in the first place. 10 years later, 4 men managed to cross into a Spanish colony in Mexico, claiming that they were the only 4 men left from the initial expedition that set out a decade ago. 4 men out of 600. I have no idea what cursed this expedition, but this thing, it was doomed the second they left Spain.
Kicking off at number 5, Novaya Zemlya. And we're starting this list with perhaps one of the most calamitous explorations in the whole of Dutch history. In their pursuit of the Arctic, that is wrought with equal parts true naval grit and equal parts just pure bad decision making. But hey, that's why these expeditions are cursed, right? Let me introduce you to a man named Wilhelm Barents, one of the most celebrated Dutch explorers of the 16th century. Born in 1550, Barents made his name as a cartographer, sailing around the Spanish seas and most of the Mediterranean, where he pretty much charted everything and anything. Like many explorers of his time, he was convinced about the existence of the Northeast Passage out in the deep depths of the Arctic, and so soon turned his sights toward there. On his first expedition, Barents didn't find much save for a polar bear out on an ice sheet. And what did his crew decide to do? Well, they tried to capture it, of course, stick it on their ship and sail back home. However, the polar bear wasn't too keen on that notion, and whilst on board, it went on a rampage and killed loads of people. However, during his first voyage, he did discover the coast of Novaya Zemlya, and he suddenly got the notion that he was onto something. Barents' next attempt came in 1595, where this time pretty much nothing happened other than another polar bear attack and more dead crewmen. On his third attempt, however, Barents was convinced that he was onto something, and in pursuit of the Northeastern Passage, he eventually made his way back to Novaya Zemlya once again. But this time, his ship and crew quickly wound up trapped in the icebergs and ice floes, and with nowhere to go, the 16-man crew was stranded with the dead of winter fast approaching. Crazily enough, Barents' crew managed to harvest scraps of lumber from their own ship, and they then built a cabin on the ice sheet to seek shelter. They lived there for nearly a year, sleeping next to heated stones and cannonballs just to stay warm, and by the time their food ran out, the crew resolved their hunger by hunting Arctic foxes and straight up killing polar bears with their bare hands. Eventually, almost 12 months later, with the ship still trapped, the crew decided to peace out. They were ridden with scurvy and were days away from eating each other, but incredibly enough, eventually they made it back to civilization. Sadly enough, Wilhelm Barents didn't. He died on the journey back, and he never did find the Northeastern Passage. Swinging in at number 4, the Magellan-Elcano circumnavigation. And if we're talking about death and pure misery, there is probably no saltier tale of the seven seas than the time that Ferdinand Magellan tried to circumnavigate the planet. Obviously, you've probably already heard of the Magellan-Elcano circumnavigation, the first recorded voyage around the world in human history, often confused with the old Marco Polo thing. The voyage itself began under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, a legendary Portuguese explorer, but was ultimately concluded by the Spanish navigator Juan Sebastian Elcano. Why? Well, that's because things got pretty bad on the way. Let me explain. Magellan's voyage set sail from Seville in 1519, but his first mistake was failing to appreciate just how unimaginably big the Pacific Ocean is. I mean, now we know it's freaking huge, but Magellan didn't have the pleasure of hindsight, and seemingly he only packed enough supplies for an average kind of ocean. After just several months at sea, Magellan's ship completely ran out of supplies, and after floating around in the middle of the Pacific at the point of near starvation, his crew began scraping the rafters for maggot-infested crumbs. Their water supplies had dwindled to mildew, and they were forced to resort to drinking their own urine just to hydrate themselves. Eventually, the crew became so ravenous with starvation that they ripped the leather from the ship's hull and began chewing on it just to satiate their hunger. After months of pure misery, Magellan and his crew did finally make landfall on the island of Guam with barely a ramshackle crew to keep it all together. A few months later, incredibly enough, Magellan made it to the Philippines, where they were then attacked by over 1,000 native warriors in the Battle of Mactan, and Magellan was stabbed in the face with a spear and then obviously died. Pretty much all of the malnourished crew were slaughtered, but another ship managed to survive, headed by Elcano, and yeah, they then completed the voyage. But as you can tell, it was pretty damn harrowing to get around the world. Next up at number 3, the Narvaez expedition. And talking of death and misery, this particular entry is pretty much unrivaled when it comes to cursed expeditions. The Spanish conquistadors of the 16th century have a bloody enough history during their march through the Americas, but no such journey is as wrought with death and misery as the Narvaez expedition. Alongside Alvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, which is a pretty impressive name, Narvaez and 600 men set sail from Spain with an appointment by the Holy Roman Emperor himself, Charles V, and set about to claim the Gulf Coast. They made their way toward the coast of Florida in pursuit of the coveted gold of the Americas, but before they could even make it there, over 100 men had deserted as the expedition made port in the Dominican Republic after fearsome tales of previous expeditions succumbing to the dangers of the continent made their way through camp. They had the right idea though, because not long afterward, Narvaez's fleet of ships were devastated by a hurricane that killed over 60 of his men and a fifth of their horses. That's before they'd even made it to Florida, but once they'd made landfall with diminished supplies and low morale, Narvaez's expedition had barely tasted the horror and pain that awaited them. After several months and failing to fully anticipate the scale and depth of the natives that called the land their home, the Spanish forces were quickly attacked by waves upon waves of native warriors, utilizing guerrilla tactics in the dense territory of the Appalachian people. Eventually, Narvaez's 600 men had dwindled to less than 250, and after crossing a rancid swamp in an attempt to escape, the expedition were near enough starving to death, many of them sick and wounded, Narvaez included. After considering cannibalism, the remaining crew decided to melt down their weapons and reforge them into tools, where hopefully they could chop down a few trees and build a ship to sail back to Mexico. Incredibly, they crafted 5 ships over a month period and set sail on September 22nd, 1528, where they were then battered by an unholy storm, ripping apart the 5 ships to splinters, killing most of the survivors. Yeah, after thinking they'd escaped, only 80 survived, who were then forced to remain in the Americas, scrapping for survival against the natives for years on end. Eventually, out of 600 men, only 4 survived. 4. Coming in at number 2, the Burke and Wills expedition. And if we're talking about failing to anticipate one's surroundings, then there's perhaps no finer example than the Burke and Wills expedition. Australia is a pretty huge place, and the vast majority of the unrelenting continent was unexplored for a good reason, because you'd probably die on the way, unless of course you were an Aboriginal Australian. That didn't deter 2 European settlers though, Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills, who were commissioned by the Royal Society of Victoria in 1860 to cross inland Australia. The expedition set out from Melbourne on August 20th, 1860 with 19 men, a herd of camels and horses, and a boatload of supplies. Everything went pretty smoothly up until October of the same year, when the 2 leaders, Burke and Wills, started to get competitive with each other, racing to meet checkpoint after checkpoint and establishing ill-fitting camps on the way. The pair failed to anticipate the strain that it would put on the return journey home. Eventually, they split up most of their expedition party, leaving the majority of them at a site known as Copper Creek, telling them to wait for 13 weeks. By early 1861, Burke and Wills had made it to the northern coastline of Australia, but couldn't technically reach the end due to dense swampland. They'd done their job and actually made it to their destination, but that's when Burke and Wills realised they needed to make it back home. On February 9, 1861, after reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria, the expedition began their long journey back to Victoria. Obviously, with their supplies dwindled and the harsh, arid climate of the Australian outback reaching fever pitch, the remaining 4 European settlers descended into a state of pure misery as the climate began to take its toll. Charles Gray was the first of the men to die after catching dysentery and being near beaten to death by Burke. Eventually, the 3 remaining men made it back to Copper Creek, only to find it abandoned. The rest of the expedition had given up on them and returned home. By June 1861, both Burke and Wills had died in their attempt to reach the appropriately named Mount Hopeless. One man did survive though, an Irish soldier named John King, who had accompanied the men on their way. He was found near death by the Yandrawanda people, indigenous Australians that had survived in the harsh deserts for thousands of years. They cared for him until he was finally rescued, the sole survivor to tell the ill-fated tale of Burke and Wills. And finally, coming in at a number 1 spot, Shackleton. Because, truth be told, we have to end this particular list on a more than positive note, because despite cursed expedition after cursed expedition, there is nothing greater than human triumph in the face of horrifying adversity. There is perhaps no greater tale of endurance than with the fated expedition of Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton, who set sail in 1914 in pursuit of fully mapping the continent of Antarctica by crossing it entirely from sea to sea. After leaving Buenos Aires on 8th of August 1914 in the aptly named ship Endurance, the expedition began steadily, but quickly the harsh and unforgiving nature of the Antarctic began to reveal itself. As they drew closer to the continent, the Endurance and its crew became stuck in the slowly solidifying pack ice and were eventually completely entombed by the frozen ocean. Now, Shackleton was a fantastic naval mind, and quickly he realized that his crew wouldn't be able to free the ship until the ice had melted on its own accord. And so they pitched up camp on the ice and waited for warmer weather. They waited for 10 agonizing months, ridden with frostbite and pain and misery, and slowly dwindling with both hope and supplies. After 10 grueling months, the Endurance sank into the icy depths before their very eyes, and that's exactly when the cracks in the ice started to show across their own camp, and before they knew it, the ice sheet that they'd called home for 10 months began to break apart. And that's when finally Shackleton rounded his men up in the last remaining lifeboat and headed for the nearest landmass, the barren and bleak Elephant Island. And as you may imagine, during those 10 months, Shackleton's crew had nothing left. Their supplies had diminished and the crew faced starvation. Shackleton knew that the only hope of survival was to try and make it to the nearest outpost of civilization, South Georgia Island, which was 800 miles away, and all they had was a lifeboat to get there. But if you know the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton and Endurance, you'll know that somehow, despite all of the odds, despite sailing through the most dangerous ocean on the planet, somehow, through sheer dumb luck and determination, the crew made it, and they survived. Out of 28 men that had left for Antarctica, 25 returned, albeit 3 years later with a few less fingers than before. Cursed expedition aside, endurance and triumph over adversity always wins out in the end. Kicking off at number 5, Stone Tongue. Which again is a pretty damn awesome name for a death metal band, right? But if you're a fan of this series, you'll already know that lists like these are literal golden skull mines for naming yourselves in all your death metal glory. So metalheads that are looking for a band name, take note, please. And also, thank me later. Anyway, Stone Tongue. Let's first cast our gaze back to 1991 in Northamptonshire, Britain, where archaeologists discovered a gruesome and even stranger mutilation that emerged from the remains of Roman Britain. Now, it's no hidden secret that Britain is littered with instances of intrigue from the Roman occupation of Britain, but this one in particular seemingly doesn't fit any sort of logic, or any of the many other mysteries of ancient Britain. At the bottom of a burial pit, buried beneath dozens of other bodies, archaeologists found the skeleton of a man whose tongue had apparently been amputated and instead replaced with a flat stone wedged into his mouth. The burial site at Stanwick near the River Nene dates back from between the 3rd or 4th centuries, where people in Roman Britain would have congregated in small farming communities. Now, it's certainly not rare to find makeshift burial pits in Roman Britain. In fact, they are a dime a dozen. But the strange thing was, this guy was buried at the bottom, face down. And not only was he buried face down, which would usually indicate some sort of fear of him by the community, but his tongue was cut out and replaced with a stone. As researchers noted, this was something that just hasn't ever been identified as a practice so far in archaeological records. There are no other known occurrences of this ever happening in Roman Britain, so far anyway. And the fact that this was on top of the matter of him being buried face down, well, Who the hell was he? What was he doing? It is believed that the man would have been in his 30s at the time of his death, and one theory is that he had mental health issues and was actually responsible for severing his own tongue. Perhaps the tongue was the community symbolically making him whole again, but then why was he buried face down? Now, archaeologists are currently trying to correlate this practice to ancient Germanic laws, but its place in a small farming community in Roman Britain, yeah, that remains a complete and utter mystery. Swinging in at number 4, Kat Shabib. And I absolutely love this one, as well as pretty much all of the next few entries, because nothing gets my mind whirring quite like an ancient structure that no one knows what the hell it is, or what it was doing, or why it was even there. Let me introduce you to the Kat Shabib, an ancient wall in southern Jordan that since its identification by British diplomat Sir Alec Kirkbride back in 1948 has had archaeologists scratching their heads ever since. I say identification because Kirkbride certainly didn't discover this structure per se, but instead he noticed that whilst he was flying over Jordan there was a very apparent and very clear line across the geographical landscape. A wall, in fact, that ran 150 kilometers, making it the longest linear archaeological site in Jordan. Now, why would anyone build a wall of such length? Now, the Romans had reason to with the Picts, ancient China had reason to with Genghis Khan, but Kat Shabib? What's that all about? The thing is though, whilst the purpose of this wall is the frantic subject of debate, we do know who built it. The semi-nomadic Bedouin people led by the Arab prince Amir Shabib. Historically, there is a certain recognition of the Bedouin people using the wall, but there is still no concrete evidence to determine its purpose. Archaeologists during the 1940s and 1950s argued that the Kat Shabib was used for military and defense purposes. However, there is a clear problem with that assumption. This wall is far too low for it to have ever been a successful defensive mechanism, and although it is massive in length, at best estimates it stood at around just 1.5 meters high. What was it keeping out? Not a lot. So then why have archaeologists also discovered over 100 ruined towers across its span? Yeah, more and more questions. Oh, and also, did I mention that best estimates point toward it being built in the Iron Age? Yeah, Kat Shabib everybody, a complete and utter mystery. Next up, at number 3, the Golan structure. Alright guys, if Kat Shabib had you scratching your head, then the Golan structure is going to require some form of head scratching machinery. Let me introduce you to the Golan structure, also known as Rajum el-Hiri, an ancient megalithic monument that resides in the Israeli-occupied portion of Golan Heights, just off of the east coast of the Sea of Galilee. Made up of more than 42,000 basalt rocks arranged in concentric circles with a mound that is 15 foot tall at its centre, the Golan structure has often been referred to as the Stonehenge of the Levant. Why? Well, of course, because it dates back to at least the early Bronze Age, to between 3000 and 2700 BCE. So what is it? Who built it? What purpose did it serve? Yeah, that'll be a we don't have a freaking clue on pretty much all of those points. The outermost wall of this structure is 520 feet in diameter and 8 feet high, and since archaeological excavations have thus far yielded very few material remains, most Israeli archaeologists believe that this site was certainly not of a defensive position or a residential quarter, but most likely, as the vast majority of these enigmas are, it was a ritual center. And not only that, but a ritual center that is possibly linked to the cult of the dead. But on that note, there's even more of a mystery, because so far no human remains have ever been found at the site, only objects pointing to its function as some kind of tomb. And also, hold on to your hats guys, because this is where it gets weirder. At the centre of the Golan structure, the actual entrance to a tomb was discovered, one that during the June and December solstices, its axis is perfectly aligned with. Yeah. More questions, fewer answers. The thing is though, as its namesake as the Stonehenge of the Levant, no other structures of its kind have ever been discovered, which is even more of a head scratcher considering the fact that in ancient Britain, as well as in South America, structures like this are pretty common. Some believe that its purpose was to worship Tammuz and Ishtar, the ancient Mesopotamian fertility gods. Others suggest that it was used by the Dakmas of the Zoroastrians to lay out their dead and let the birds remove the flesh from their bones. Some say that it was a calendar or a site to observe the constellations for religious calculations. Maybe it was all of these things at some point in time, but as it remains, we may never know. Coming in at number 2, the Great Lakes Copper Mystery. Oh boy, here we go. If you're not already feeling perplexed at the mysteries of the ancient world, then I'm fairly certain that this one will knock your metaphorical socks off. In the wilds of Michigan's Isle Royale National Park, it remains a beautiful and remote location, but thousands of years ago, the island was home to a thriving mining industry. Yes, mining. The rich veins of copper that ripple through the site's bedrock certainly drew the attention of the early Native Americans, and the fact that they diligently used this ore to make tools and jewelry is evident still. But the actual extent of their operation remains a complete and utter mystery. Why? Well, because around 6,500 years ago there is clear and startling evidence to suggest that roughly 500,000 tons of copper was mined from the land. 500,000 tons of copper, which simply put is a staggering amount. Now, the copper culture complex is an astounding feat of ancient civilization regardless, but here is where our mystery takes another turn. You know why? Because Michigan copper is some of the purest copper on the planet. Keep that thought in mind. And 500,000 tons of it, well, frankly put, there should be more evidence to its use throughout the Midwest. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a leap here, and I'm going to point us toward another ancient mystery, one that occurred off the coast of Turkey, roughly around the 14th century BC. A shipwreck that was discovered just off the east shore of Uluburun, discovered by a sponge diver back in 1982. Now, the Uluburun shipwreck is a bit of a mystery in and of itself, but it's with the content of its cargo that we're concerned with here. Within the hull of the shipwreck, over 10 tons of copper oxide ingots were discovered. Now, oxide ingots, which are named so down to the fact that they are shaped with rectangular handholds on either side, were relatively common in the late Bronze Age period of the Mediterranean Sea. You know what is weird? Testing on these ingots later discovered that they were extraordinarily pure for others of its kind. In fact, more than 99.5% pure. The oxides themselves were brittle blister copper with voids and slag bits that only occur when multiple pourings were made outdoors over wood fires. There is only one type of ore of this purity, Michigan copper, the kind mined over 6,500 years ago in the copper culture complex of North America. Yeah, beats me, guys. And finally, coming in at number one spot, the Ness of Brodgar. And I absolutely adore this particular Neolithic mystery, and at the moment this is pretty much my direct inspiration for scholarly study of the ancient world. Now, we've covered this area quite a few times on this channel, and if you'd like to find out more about places like Skara Brae, the ancient site discovered on the Orkney Isles of northern Scotland, then please check out our Scottish history list, and also, you know, do your own discovering, because Neolithic Orkney is absolutely amazing. But there's another place that is even more remarkable than Skara Brae, the Ness of Brodgar, perhaps one of the most important discoveries in archaeological record depicting just what the hell was going on during the Neolithic period of ancient Britain. Now, back in 2003, in a site that occupies the central position with the Orkney archipelago that lies between the locks of Stenness and Harray, an imposing complex of monuments were discovered, a series of structures that seemingly were of pivotal importance to Neolithic Orcadians, and perhaps even further afield, perhaps even the whole of ancient Britain. The site itself, which lies between the already discovered ring of Brodgar, a Neolithic stone circle that has its own mysteries, as well as the equally mysterious stones of Stenness, dates back to at least 3,300 BC. As of 2016, 14 structures have been discovered, with many of them being built on top of each other, suggesting perhaps an even older use of this site and a location of incredible importance to the Neolithic people of ancient Britain. Without a doubt though, the most impressive structure, known as Structure 10, which appears to be a Neolithic pyramid, is even more of a head scratcher. Yeah, I just said Neolithic pyramid. Around this site, which was used prolifically up until around 2200 BCE, after which it abruptly stopped, archaeologists have since discovered the bones of approximately 400 cattle, around which the carcasses of several red deer were placed, with many of their tibia bones being cracked and extracted for marrow, suggesting the site of a feast. Do you know what's weirder though? During this event, there is also evidence of the temple being largely destroyed, brick by brick. Seemingly, for some reason, the Neolithic Orcadians built this site as a place of incredible importance, used it for 1,000 years, and then one day threw a party and tore the whole thing down. I have no idea, guys, but most importantly, I want to know.